I left the detention center alone, but a forgotten ranch in the hills held the family I'd been searching for. If you've ever felt like your story was written for you by someone else, like you were just a name on a file, then stick around. This story is for you. Hit that subscribe button because we're going to talk about what it means to find your own ending. The day I turned 18 was the day I ceased to be a ward of the state. There was no cake, no party, just the hollow echo of a steel door sliding shut behind me for the last time. For 2 years, my world had been concrete floors, fluorescent lights humming a constant anxious tune, and the smell of industrial cleaner that never quite masked the scent of sweat and despair. Now, standing on a cracked sidewalk under a bleached-out sky, the world felt too big, too loud. The air itself seemed to press in on me, heavy with a freedom I had no idea what to do with. My caseworker, a tired man named Mr. Davies, whose face was a permanent roadmap of disappointment, had handed me a single cardboard box. "Everything you came in with, Leo," he'd said, not unkindly, but without any real warmth. It was the voice of a man who had seen hundreds of kids just like me walk out that door and knew the statistics. I sat on a bus stop bench, the city's traffic a roaring, unfamiliar river. I didn't open the box right away. For a moment I just held it on my lap, the cheap cardboard cool against my jeans. It represented the entirety of my worldly possessions, the sum total of a life before it was interrupted. A life I barely remembered. My parents were ghosts, faded photographs in my memory, gone in a car crash when I was young. After that, it was a blur of foster homes, each one a different shade of temporary, until a stupid mistake at 16, joyriding in a car that wasn't mine, landed me in juvie. I'd spent 2 years paying for that mistake, 2 years where the world kept turning while I was held in place. 2 years of being told who I was, what I'd done, and what I would likely become. Now the silence from the system was deafening. I was free, and I had never felt more lost. Finally, my fingers fumbled with the tape on the box. Inside, it was mostly what I expected: a worn-out pair of sneakers, a couple of faded t-shirts, a dog-eared paperback I'd read a dozen times. But underneath it all were 2 things that didn't belong to the scared 16-year-old who was arrested. The first was a thin, black leather wallet. It was empty except for a single, crisp $20 bill and a folded, laminated photograph. The photo was old, the colors washed out. A man with kind, crinkled eyes and a thick, white beard stood with his arm around a young boy. The boy was me. Maybe 5 or 6 years old, grinning a gap-toothed smile. The man was my grandfather. I remembered him in flashes, the scent of sawdust and pipe tobacco, the low rumble of his voice telling me stories. He'd disappeared from my life shortly after my parents died. The official story was that he was too old and sick to care for me. I'd always believed he abandoned me, another person who found me too much to handle. Seeing his face again was like a punch to the gut, a hollow ache of a loss I'd long since buried. The second item was a thick, cream-colored envelope, heavy and stiff with age. My name, Leo Vance, was written across the front in an elegant looping script that I recognized instantly as my grandfather's. It felt ancient, a relic from another time. My hands trembled as I turned it over. There was no stamp, no address. It had been meant for me, but not for the mail. With a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic beating in my chest, I carefully tore it open. Inside was a single, heavy, old-fashioned brass key tied with a piece of twine to a folded piece of paper, and beneath that, several pages of stationery covered in that same familiar handwriting. I unfolded the first note. It was short, a simple directive. "Leo," it began. The sight of my name in his hand was overwhelming. "If you are reading this, you are 18. You are a man. There is a place that belongs to you now. The key is for the front door. The address is on the back of this note. The rest of the letters will explain. Be careful. Trust no one until you understand. I flipped the paper over. An address was written there, not in the city, but for a place called Blackwood Canyon, a rural route number in a town I'd never heard of. Tucked into the fold of the note was a business card. Alvarez and Dunn, attorneys at law. A name was circled in red ink. Maria Alvarez. I sat there on that bench for what felt like an hour, the roar of the city fading into a dull hum. The sun began to dip, painting the smoggy sky in shades of orange and purple. Abandonment. That's what I had built my life around. The story I told myself was that I was alone because I was unwanted. My parents left me by dying. My grandfather left me by choice. The system held me because no one else would. But this was something else. This was a plan, a key, an address, a lawyer, a mystery handed to me on the day of my release. It wasn't a home, not yet. It was just a thread. But for the first time in years, it was a thread leading somewhere other than a dead end. I folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope with the others, and clutched the heavy brass key in my palm. The metal was cold, solid. It was real. I stood up, the cardboard box under my arm, and used the $20 bill my grandfather had left me to buy a burner phone from a corner store. My first call wasn't to a friend. I didn't have any. It was to the name on the card. A woman picked up on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. Alvarez. "Hello," I said, my own voice sounding rough and unused. "My name is Leo Vance. I was told to call you. I think I've inherited something." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the sound of a pen tapping on a desk. "Mr. Vance," she said, her tone shifting slightly, becoming warmer, more human. "We've been waiting for your call. Your grandfather set up a trust. It's not much, I'm afraid, but it includes the deed to his property in Blackwood Canyon and a small fund for your transition. I can arrange for a bus ticket and wire you a little money for the trip." I listened, stunned into silence. A trust, a fund, a plan. My grandfather hadn't abandoned me. He had been waiting for me. "Leo, are you still there?" Ms. Alvarez asked. I cleared my throat. "Yes," I managed to say. "Yes, I'm here." For the first time that day, I believed it. I was here, and I was finally going somewhere. The journey to Blackwood Canyon was long, a slow peeling away of the world I knew. The city's dense, gray sprawl eventually gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to flat, open farmland that stretched for hours under a vast, empty sky. The bus was old, the seats worn, and the air thick with the smell of diesel and stale coffee. I sat with my forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window, watching the landscape change. With every mile that passed, the knot of anxiety in my stomach began to loosen, replaced by a strange, fragile sense of anticipation. I had the box of letters on my lap, but I didn't read them. Not yet. I wanted to be there, at the place the key belonged, before I unlocked the story they held. I thought about my grandfather. The memories were patchy, like glimpses through a fog. I remembered the rough, calloused feel of his hand holding mine. I remembered him teaching me how to skip stones across a creek, his low laugh when my stone sank immediately. He was a quiet man, solid and calm, a mountain of a man to my small childhood self. Why did he leave? Why did he let me go into the system? The questions echoed in my mind, a constant low hum beneath the drone of the bus engine. The official story had been so simple, so clean. He was old. He was poor. He couldn't cope. But the heavy envelope in my lap, the lawyer, the trust, it all pointed to a different story, a more complicated one. It suggested a sacrifice, not an abandonment. And that thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. If he hadn't abandoned me, then my entire understanding of myself was wrong. I wasn't the boy who was thrown away. I was the boy who was protected. Hidden? The possibilities were dizzying. I spent the night on the bus, curled uncomfortably in my seat, drifting in and out of a restless sleep filled with dreams of locked doors and winding country roads. When I woke, the world outside my window had transformed. The flat plains had buckled and risen into rolling hills, then into the jagged, pine-covered shoulders of mountains. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale golden light over the landscape. The air that seeped through the window vents was different here, crisp, clean, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. We were climbing, the old bus groaning in protest as it navigated the winding roads. The town of Blackwood, when we finally arrived, wasn't much of a town at all. It was a single main street with a handful of buildings, a general store with a weathered wooden porch, a gas station with old-fashioned pumps, a small diner with a flickering neon sign, and a post office. That was it. The bus hissed to a stop in front of the general store, and the driver called out the name. I was the only one who got off. I stood on the dusty sidewalk, my box in my hand, and a small duffel bag Ms. Alvarez had helped me purchase with the wired funds slung over my shoulder. The silence was absolute, broken only by the chirping of birds and the rustle of wind in the tall pines that surrounded the town. It felt like a place that time had forgotten. A rusty pickup truck was parked in front of the store, an old man with a face like a dried apple sitting in the driver's seat. He watched me for a moment, his eyes narrowed, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. I nodded back, feeling like an alien who had just landed on a foreign planet. I went inside the store. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something sweet, like cinnamon. A woman with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair stood behind the counter. "You must be Leo," she said, her voice warm. Word travels fast in a place this small. "I'm Martha. Your lawyer, Ms. Alvarez, called ahead, said you might need a ride out to the old Vance place." I was taken aback by the casual kindness. In the city, a stranger was a threat. Here, it seemed, a stranger was just someone you hadn't met yet. "Thank you," I said, my voice quiet. "I would appreciate that." An hour later, I was in the passenger seat of another old pickup, this one driven by a man named Hank, Martha's husband. He was a man of few words, which suited me just fine. We drove out of the small cluster of buildings and onto a dirt road that wound its way deeper into the mountains. The road got rougher, the trees thicker. Sunlight dappled through the canopy, painting shifting patterns on the dusty dashboard. "Your granddad was a good man," Hank said suddenly, his voice raspy. Quiet, kept to himself, but he was solid. Helped me fix my roof one year after a bad winter storm. Didn't ask for a dime. He glanced over at me. "You've got his eyes." The words settled in my chest, a small, warm weight. It was the first time anyone had ever connected me to my family in a positive way, not as the son of the deceased or the ward of the state, but as the grandson of a good man. We rounded a final bend, and Hank slowed the truck to a stop. "This is it," he said, gesturing with his chin. I looked out the window, and my breath caught in my throat. Set back from the road, at the end of a long, overgrown driveway, was a house. It was a simple two-story farmhouse, its white paint peeled and weathered to a soft gray. The roof of the porch sagged slightly, and vines crawled up one side of the house, but it stood straight and proud against the backdrop of the dark mountains. To one side was a large barn, its red paint faded to a dull rust color, and beyond that, fields that had long since gone wild, dotted with wildflowers. It was neglected, forgotten, but it was beautiful. It looked patient, like it had been waiting. "Needs work," Hank said, stating the obvious. "But the bones are good. Your granddad built it to last." I got out of the truck, my legs feeling unsteady. I walked slowly up the driveway, the gravel crunching under my worn-out sneakers. The air was cool and smelled of wild mint and pine. I reached the front porch and climbed the creaking steps. The brass key felt heavy in my hand. It was worn smooth from use, its edges soft. I slid it into the lock. It turned with a satisfying, solid click. I pushed the door open, and it swung inward with a low groan, disturbing dust motes that danced in the shafts of light, slanting through the grimy windows. The inside of the house smelled of old wood, dust, and time itself. It was a scent not of decay, but of hibernation. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, draped in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. I stepped inside and pulled the sheet off a large armchair. The fabric was worn but intact. I ran my hand over it, imagining my grandfather sitting here, looking out the window at the mountains. I walked through the downstairs rooms, a living room with a large stone fireplace, a simple kitchen with an old wood-burning stove, a small study filled with bookshelves. The books were still there, their spines faded, titles of classics and history and books on carpentry and engineering. It was the library of a man who had built his own world. Upstairs there were 2 bedrooms. One was small and simple, clearly his. The other had a small bed and a window that looked out over the front fields. A child's room. My room. There was a faint, faded drawing of a rocket ship taped to the wall. I touched it, the paper brittle with age. A memory flickered, my grandfather holding me up to the window to see the stars, telling me I could fly to them one day. A wave of grief so sharp and sudden, it almost brought me to my knees, washed over me. This wasn't just a house. It was a history. My history. And it had been here, waiting for me, all this time. After exploring the house, a sense of profound exhaustion settled over me. I hadn't truly rested in years, not in the way that meant feeling safe. I found a broom in the kitchen pantry and spent an hour sweeping the dust and cobwebs from the floor of the main bedroom. The physical work was grounding, the simple act of clearing a space for myself a declaration of intent. I pulled the dusty sheet off the bed, revealing a sturdy mattress. Using the money Ms. Alvarez had sent, I had bought a few essentials in town. A sleeping bag, a pillow, some non-perishable food, and a large jug of water. I unrolled the sleeping bag onto the mattress. The sun was setting, filling the room with a soft, orange glow. For the first time, I didn't feel the familiar dread that came with nightfall in the institution. There were no clanging doors, no shouting, no hum of electric locks. There was only the sound of the wind sighing through the pines and the distant call of a night bird. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally pulled the thick envelope from my bag. The time for waiting was over. The stack of letters was tied together with a faded red ribbon. I untied it carefully, my fingers feeling clumsy. The pages were thin, almost translucent with age, and covered in my grandfather's steady, elegant script. I unfolded the first one, dated just a few weeks after I was taken into state custody. My heart hammered against my ribs. "My dearest Leo," it began. "If you are reading this, then my plan has worked, at least in part. You're safe and you are home. I know you must have so many questions. I know you must hate me. I need you to understand that every day since they took you has been the hardest day of my life. I need you to know that letting you go was the only way I could save you." I had to stop and take a breath, the words blurring through a sudden film of tears. Hate him? Yes, I had. I had nurtured that hate in the cold, lonely corners of foster homes and the stark reality of the detention center. It had been a shield. Now that shield was cracking. I continued reading. He explained that my parents hadn't died in a simple car accident. It was more complicated. They had been working for a large chemical company, my father as an engineer, my mother as a research assistant. They had uncovered evidence that the company was illegally dumping toxic waste in rural areas, poisoning the water table. They had gathered proof, documents, data, samples, and were planning to go to the authorities. "They were brave, Leo," he wrote. braver than anyone I have ever known. But they were naive. They underestimated how ruthless these people were. The company found out. The accident was no accident. It was a message. My blood ran cold. The story I had been told my whole life, the tragic but simple narrative of an orphan, was a lie, a fabrication designed to cover up a murder. After the funeral, the letter went on, I started receiving threats, anonymous phone calls, people watching the house. They knew your parents had given me a copy of their evidence for safekeeping. They wanted it, and they were willing to do anything to get it. I knew I couldn't protect you, a frail old man against a powerful corporation. They would have taken you from me, or worse. They would have used you to get to me. So I made the hardest choice of my life. I created a story. I told the social workers I was unwell, that I was destitute. I made myself seem like an unfit guardian. I let them take you, my boy. I let them take you so you would be lost in the system, a ghost, anonymous, safe. They couldn't find you if you were just another number on a state file. I dropped the letter, my hands shaking violently. I stumbled to the window and stared out into the deepening twilight. The world I knew had been dismantled in a few paragraphs. I wasn't abandoned. I was hidden. My grandfather hadn't thrown me away. He had sacrificed his name, his reputation, and his heart to build a wall around me. The 2 years I spent in juvie, the years I spent cursing his name, had been, in his eyes, a success. I was off the grid. I was alive. I sank to the floor, the weight of this new reality crushing me. I cried then, not the silent, angry tears I had shed in my bunk at the detention center, but deep, ragged sobs that tore through me. I cried for the parents I never knew, for their bravery and their fate. I cried for the grandfather who had endured a living death, watching me from afar, bearing my hatred as a form of protection. And I cried for the boy who had spent his life believing he was worthless, only to find out he was priceless, a treasure worth protecting at any cost. The truth didn't set me free, not yet. It shackled me to a past that was far darker and more complex than I could have ever imagined. I sat on that floor until the moon rose high in the sky, its pale light a cold comfort through the dusty window pane. The house was silent around me, holding its breath. It knew these secrets. It had been keeping them for me. After a long while, I picked up the letter again, my tears drying on my cheeks. There was more. He told me he had hidden the evidence my parents had collected. I couldn't destroy it, he wrote. That would have meant they died for nothing. But I couldn't keep it anywhere obvious. It's safe. When you are ready, and only when you are ready, this house will tell you where. The letter ended with a sentence that would become my mantra in the days to come. Your inheritance, Leo, is not this land or this house. It is a choice. Their fight can be your fight if you choose it. Or you can walk away and live the life they died to give you. The choice is yours. Whatever you decide, know that you were loved. You were always, always loved. I folded the letter and placed it carefully on the windowsill. I didn't read the others. It was too much for one night. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the scent of dust and old wood filling my senses. Sleep did not come easily. My mind raced, replaying my grandfather's words, reevaluating every memory, every moment of my life through this new, shattering lens. The anger I had carried for so long was gone, replaced by a profound, aching sorrow and a terrifying sense of responsibility. I was no longer just Leo Vance, ex-delinquent. I was the keeper of a secret, the heir to a battle I never knew was being fought. The night was long, filled with the unfamiliar sounds of the country, the hoot of an owl, the creak of the old house settling, the whisper of wind. Each sound seemed to be speaking to me, reminding me that I was in a place that held the truth. When dawn finally broke, casting a gray, misty light into the room. I felt a strange sense of calm. The shock had subsided, leaving behind a quiet, resolute determination. I had a purpose. I didn't know what it was yet, but it started here, in this house, with these letters. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. I needed to make the house livable, not just as a shelter, but as a base of operations. I took Hank up on his offer of occasional work, mending fences and clearing brush on his property for a little cash. It was hard, physical labor, but my body, hardened by the regimented routines of the detention center, responded well. The work cleared my head, and the rhythm of it, the swing of an axe, the stretching of wire, was meditative. In the evenings, I would return to the ranch, exhausted but clear-headed. I read one more of my grandfather's letters each night. They were a chronicle of his lonely vigil. He wrote about watching me from a distance, getting updates from a sympathetic contact he had within the social services system. He knew about my foster homes. He knew when I got into trouble. My heart broke when I heard you'd been sent to the center, one letter read. But a part of me was relieved. I knew you would be contained, accounted for. No one could get to you in there. It was the safest you'd been in years. Forgive me for that thought. I explored the property methodically, trying to see it through his eyes. What did he mean when he said the house would tell me where the evidence was hidden? I ran my hands along the stone fireplace, tapping each stone, listening for a hollow sound. I checked the bookshelves, pulling out books, shaking them, looking for hidden compartments. I searched the kitchen, the pantry, the cellar. Nothing. The house kept its secrets well. One afternoon, while clearing out the old barn, I found his workshop. It was at the very back, a small, windowless room I had overlooked. The door was swollen shut, and I had to use a crowbar to pry it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of grease, sawdust, and metal. Tools hung in neat, orderly rows on the walls, saws, drills, wrenches, all meticulously cared for. A large workbench stood against one wall, covered in a dusty canvas sheet. I pulled the sheet off, revealing a heavy-duty vise and a set of intricate-looking metalworking tools. My grandfather, it seemed, was more than just a carpenter. On the workbench, propped against the wall, was a framed blueprint. It wasn't for a building, but for a complex piece of machinery, full of gears and levers. I didn't understand what it was, but the precision of the drawing was breathtaking. Tucked into the corner of the frame was a small, folded piece of paper. I pulled it out. It was a map of the ranch property, hand-drawn with incredible detail. It showed the house, the barn, the creek that ran along the back of the property, and the boundaries of the land. But there were other markings, too. A series of small X's were drawn along the creek bed, and a single large X was marked in a densely wooded area in the northwest corner of the property, labeled simply Bedrock. It felt significant, another piece of the puzzle. I was about to fold the map and put it in my pocket when I noticed something else. Underneath the workbench, almost completely hidden in the shadows, was a small metal lockbox. It was bolted to the floor. It wasn't the kind of box you could pry open. It was heavy-duty with a combination lock. My heart leaped. This had to be it. But what was the combination? I tried my birthday. Nothing. His birthday? I didn't even know it. I spent an hour trying random numbers, frustration mounting with each failed attempt. I was about to give up for the day when my eyes fell back on the blueprint on the workbench. It was covered in numbers, measurements, angles, ratios. It was a long shot, but what if? I looked for a prominent number, something that stood out. Near the top, a final calculation was circled in red. 3/17/42. It could be anything, a date, a part number, or a combination. With trembling fingers, I knelt by the lockbox and spun the dial. Right to 3, left past 3 to 17, right to 42. I pulled the handle. There was a loud metallic clunk. It opened. I stared at the open box for a long moment, my breath held tight in my chest. Inside, there was no dramatic treasure, no pile of gold. There was just a thick, waterproof portfolio, the kind architects use, and a single, small, velvet bag. I opened the bag first. It contained a key, but not for a door. It was a key to a safe deposit box with a tag attached that simply read, City National Bank. The portfolio was heavy. I lifted it out and placed it on the workbench. My hands were shaking again. This was the core of it all. The evidence my parents had died for, the secret my grandfather had dedicated his life to protecting. I untied the flap and opened it. The portfolio was filled with documents. There were geological survey maps, much more detailed than the one on the wall, showing chemical plumes spreading from specific locations. There were internal company memos stamped confidential, discussing containment failures and acceptable levels of public risk. There were pages and pages of chemical analysis data, with handwritten notes from my mother in the margins, her handwriting sharp and intelligent, and at the bottom there was a stack of photographs. They showed corroded barrels, some leaking a dark, oily substance into the ground, half buried in shallow pits. The locations in the photos matched the X's on my grandfather's hand-drawn map. This was it, the undeniable proof. The corporation my parents had worked for was called North Star Chemical. But as I sifted through the memos, another name kept appearing, Project Apex, and there were references to a parent company, a holding group called Apex Development. A cold dread washed over me. I had seen that name before. I ran back to the house, my boots pounding on the dusty floorboards, and into the small study. I rummaged through a pile of old mail on the desk, junk mail my grandfather had never thrown away. And there it was, a letter addressed to him from Apex Development. It was a ridiculously low offer to purchase the ranch. The date on it was from just a few months ago. They were still trying to get the land. They didn't just want to silence the past, they wanted to own the ground where their crimes were buried. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The marked location on the map, bedrock. It wasn't just a geological feature, it was a location. The portfolio contained the data, the proof, but my grandfather was a practical man. He knew paper could be destroyed. He would have kept a physical sample. The X on the map wasn't marking a treasure, it was marking a crime scene. The real evidence, the core samples my parents must have taken, was still out there, buried in the woods. And this company, Apex, was trying to buy the land to bulldoze it, to erase the last vestiges of their wrongdoing forever. The weight of it all was immense. This was so much bigger than my family. It was about poisoned water, about a corporation that valued profit over human lives, a company that had murdered my parents and was now trying to erase their legacy. My phone buzzed in my pocket, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent house. It was an unknown number. I hesitated, my grandfather's warning, "Trust no one," echoing in my head. But my curiosity got the better of me. I answered. "Leo Vance?" A smooth, confident voice asked. "Yes?" "My name is Richard Sterling. I'm a senior acquisitions manager with Apex Development. I believe you've recently taken possession of the Vance property in Blackwood Canyon." My blood turned to ice. They knew. They knew I was here. "How did you get this number?" I asked, my voice tight. "We're a resourceful company, Mr. Vance," he said, a hint of amusement in his tone. "Listen, I'll be blunt. Your grandfather was a sentimental old man who refused every generous offer we made him for that useless piece of rock. We're prepared to make you a final offer, one that will allow you to go anywhere, be anyone you want. We know about your past. A young man like you could use a fresh start, a clean slate, $500,000, tax-free. All you have to do is sign the deed. $500,000. The number hung in the air, surreal, obscene. It was more money than I had ever imagined. It was a ticket out, a new life, free from the shadows of my past, free from the weight of this fight. I could take that money and disappear. It was the easy way out. It was the life my parents had died to give me, a life of freedom. But was it, or was it blood money, a payment for my silence? I'll need to think about it, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Don't think too long, Sterling said, his voice losing its friendly veneer, replaced by a cold edge. This offer is on the table for 48 hours. After that, we'll have to explore other, more permanent solutions to acquiring the property. I'm sure you understand. The line went dead. He hadn't just made an offer. He had made a threat. I stood there in the dusty study, the phone still pressed to my ear, the silence of the house pressing in on me. This was the choice my grandfather had written about. It was no longer a theoretical dilemma. It was here, now, in the form of a $500,000 offer and a veiled threat. I could run, or I could fight. The voices of the past 2 years swirled in my head. The guards, the caseworkers, the judges, all telling me I was a lost cause, a screw-up destined to fail. Taking the money would prove them right. It would be a surrender. But fighting meant taking on a faceless, powerful corporation that had already murdered 2 people to protect its secrets. It was an impossible, terrifying prospect. I felt a wave of panic rise in my throat. I was just a kid, an ex-con with no resources, no allies. What could I possibly do? I needed to get out, to breathe. I grabbed the hand-drawn map from the workshop and a shovel from the barn and headed out towards the northwest corner of the property. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I needed to see it. I needed to stand on the ground my parents had died to protect. The hike was difficult. The woods were dense and tangled, the ground uneven. I followed the creek, its gurgling sound a steady companion. After an hour of pushing through underbrush and climbing over fallen logs, I found it, a small clearing dominated by a large outcrop of exposed bedrock, just as the map had indicated. The air here felt different, heavy and still. I looked around, my eyes scanning the ground, and then I saw it, a patch of earth where the vegetation was sparse, discolored, sickly looking. It was subtle, but it was there. This was the place. This was the X. I took a deep breath and began to dig. The soil was soft at first, but a few feet down, my shovel hit something hard with a dull thud. It wasn't rock. I dropped to my knees and clawed at the dirt with my hands. My fingers brushed against cold, smooth metal. I dug faster, my heart pounding, until I had uncovered the top of a long metal tube, about 6 inches in diameter, sealed at the top with a heavy-duty cap. It was a core sample container. It was still here. It was real. I sat back on my heels, staring at the canister as if it were a bomb. In a way, it was. It was the truth, buried in the earth. And I had just unearthed it. In that moment, standing in that poisoned clearing, the choice became devastatingly clear. Running wasn't an option, not anymore. Taking their money would make me complicit in their crimes. It would be a betrayal of my parents, of my grandfather, of the very land under my feet. Their fight was my fight now. It was my inheritance. I left the sample canister where it was, covering it carefully with dirt and leaves. No one would find it unless they knew exactly where to look. I walked back to the house, the setting sun casting long shadows through the trees. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But now it was accompanied by something else. A cold, hard anger, a sense of purpose. I was no longer a victim of my circumstances. I was a participant. When I got back to the house, I made 2 calls. The first was to Ms. Alvarez. I told her everything. I told her about the letters, the portfolio, the core sample, the offer from Apex, and the threat. She was silent for a long moment after I finished. I could hear the faint sound of her breathing on the other end of the line. Leo, she said finally, her voice low and serious, you are in a very dangerous situation, but you also have something very powerful. This is bigger than a simple inheritance case now. This is David versus Goliath. I know, I said. Can you help me? The legal fees for something like this will be astronomical, she warned. I'm not equipped for a corporate malfeasance suit of this magnitude, but I know people who are. Environmental law specialists, pro bono groups who live for this kind of fight. If you're sure about this, Leo, I can make some calls. I can be your liaison. I'm sure, I said, my voice steady. Good, she replied, and for the first time I heard a note of something like pride in her voice. Don't answer any more calls from unknown numbers. Stay on the property. I'll be in touch within 24 hours. The second call was harder. It was to Richard Sterling at Apex Development. He picked up on the first ring. Mr. Vance, I trust you've had time to consider my generous offer. I have, I said, my hand gripping the phone so tightly, my knuckles were white. I took a deep breath, the air in the dusty house seeming to crackle with tension. And my answer is no. There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. I could almost feel his surprise, his indignation. You're making a grave mistake, kid, he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing snarl. A very, very big mistake. You have no idea who you're dealing with. And you have no idea who you're dealing with, I retorted, a surge of adrenaline washing away my fear. I was my parents' son. I was my grandfather's grandson. This property is not for sale. I hung up before he could reply. I knew I had just painted a target on my back. The 48-hour window was no longer about an offer. It was about a threat. But I wasn't scared. I was electrified. For the first time in my life, I had made a choice that was entirely my own. A choice based not on survival, but on conviction. I had chosen my family. I had chosen their fight. Now I want to take a moment and just talk to you. If you've made it this far, thank you. This part of the story, this moment of choice, is something I think we all face in one way or another. Maybe it's not a multi-million-dollar corporation, but we all come to a crossroads where we have to decide between the easy path and the right one, between silence and speaking up. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where you had to decide what you truly stand for? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I believe our stories are how we find our strength. You are not alone in your fight, whatever it may be. Now, let's get back to what happened next. The 48 hours after that phone call were the longest of my life. I barely slept. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of leaves outside sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept the doors locked and a heavy iron poker from the fireplace by my side. I was a prisoner in my own home, but this time it was a self-imposed exile for a purpose. I spent the time organizing the evidence, making copies of the key documents with the camera on my burner phone and emailing them to a new, secure account. Ms. Alvarez called back the next day. She had been in contact with a renowned environmental law firm in the city. They were interested, very interested. They specialized in taking down corporate polluters and had a team of investigators and lawyers who were, in her words, absolute sharks. They were willing to take the case on contingency, meaning they wouldn't get paid unless they won. They're sending an investigator, she said, a man named Ben Carter. He's ex-FBI, discreet and very good at what he does. He'll be there tomorrow to retrieve the portfolio and get your official statement. He'll also arrange for a forensics team to properly extract and secure the core sample. A wave of relief washed over me. I wasn't alone in this anymore. I had allies, powerful ones. The next day, a nondescript sedan rolled up my driveway. A man in his late 50s with a calm, watchful face and weary eyes that had seen too much, got out. He introduced himself as Ben Carter. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. I showed him the portfolio, and he examined the documents with a practiced eye, his expression unreadable. "This is dynamite," he said quietly, after a few minutes. "Your parents were very thorough." I then led him out to the site, to the buried core sample. He took photos, marked the location on a GPS, and told me a team would be there before dawn the next day to excavate it. "You've done good, kid," he said as he prepared to leave. "Your grandfather's plan, hiding you in plain sight, it was a hell of a gamble, but it worked. They never saw you coming." He paused at his car door. "A piece of advice. Apex will try to discredit you. They'll use your juvenile record. They'll call you a disgruntled, opportunistic delinquent. Don't let them. You know the truth. Hold on to it." The legal battle that followed was long and brutal, just as Ms. Alvarez had predicted. It took over a year. Apex threw everything they had at me. They tried to paint me as a liar, a fantasist, an extortionist. My juvenile record was plastered all over the media they controlled. They hired private investigators to dig for dirt, to intimidate me. There were times when the pressure was so intense I thought I would break, but I never did. I had the letters from my grandfather, which I reread whenever my resolve wavered. I had the support of Ms. Alvarez, who called me every week, not just as a lawyer, but as a friend. And I had the memory of my parents, their quiet bravery a constant source of strength. During that year, I poured all my energy into the ranch. I learned to repair the roof, to replace the rotten porch boards, to cultivate a small garden. Hank and Martha from the general store became my steadfast friends, bringing me supplies and news from town. I learned that many other families in the valley had been pressured by Apex, their wells running foul, their livestock getting sick. My fight became their fight. I was no longer just an outsider. I was part of the community, bound together by a common enemy. The turning point came when the law firm, armed with the core sample and my parents' data, managed to get a court order for widespread soil and water testing across the valley. The results were catastrophic for Apex. The contamination was far worse than even my parents had suspected. Faced with irrefutable scientific evidence, shareholder revolt, and a media firestorm that they could no longer control, Apex finally crumbled. They settled. The settlement was massive. It included a huge fund to clean up the valley, compensation for every family affected, and a public admission of wrongdoing. My portion of the settlement was substantial, far more than the $500,000 they had offered me to stay silent. But by then, the money was almost an afterthought. The real victory was the truth. The names of my parents, John and Sarah Vance, were cleared. They weren't just victims of a car crash. They were heroes who had given their lives to expose a crime. Their story was finally told. Their sacrifice finally honored. The ranch is different now. The house is repaired with a new roof and a fresh coat of paint. The fields are no longer wild. I've started a small, organic farm providing fresh produce to the town that took me in. The barn is my workshop, where I've taken up my grandfather's love of woodworking. The scent of sawdust, a comforting link to him. The money from the settlement sits in a trust, the same way my grandfather set one up for me. I use it to fund legal aid for other communities, fighting similar battles. It's not my money. It's a weapon for justice. I never found another family in the traditional sense. I don't have parents or siblings, but I found something more. I found a community in the people of Blackwood Canyon. I found a legacy in the fight my parents started, and I found a home, not just in the house my grandfather built, but within myself. I am no longer the lost boy who walked out of a detention center with nothing but a box of old clothes. I know who I am. I am the son of heroes. I am the grandson of a guardian. I am the keeper of a promise. My inheritance wasn't the land or the money or even the truth. It was the choice to stand for something, to fight for those who can't, to turn a story of loss into a story of justice. It's a choice I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of. And so, my story isn't really about a forgotten ranch or a hidden secret. It's about what it means to inherit a legacy. We all inherit something: our parents' eyes, our grandmother's laugh, or sometimes a fight that was started long before we were born. The most important thing I've learned is that home isn't a place you're given. It's a place you build. It's a choice you make every single day to show up, to do the work, to honor the past, and to fight for a better future. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever felt like you had to fight for your own truth, I hope you'll join our community here. Subscribe to the channel and share your own story in the comments, because every story of survival, of resilience, of choosing the harder right over the easier wrong deserves to be heard. You matter, your story matters, and you are not alone.